The last thing Ridge Harding heard before the door closed behind him was the sound of the latch clicking into place. Not a slam, not raised voices, just that quiet final click, the kind of sound that means something is over, and the person on the other side has already decided not to think about it anymore. He stood on the porch steps with an old backpack hanging off one shoulder, and his 7-year-old brother pressed against his side, and he looked out at the tree line at the edge of the property. The pine forest began maybe 200 yards past the gravel driveway. Beyond it, nothing he could name. Just darkness collecting between the trunks as the afternoon light failed. Wren hadn't said anything yet. That was the part that hurt the most. When their mother died 4 years ago, Wren had cried for 3 days straight. When their father went 2 years after that, a logging road black ice a truck that never should have been on that stretch of highway in February, Wren had gone very quiet for a long time. But eventually he'd come back. He'd started talking again. Started asking questions the way 7-year-olds do relentlessly about everything, as if the world owed him explanations. Right now, he wasn't asking anything. He was just holding onto the sleeve of Ridge's jacket with both hands, the way he used to hold their mother's hand in parking lots when he was very small and staring at the gravel between his boots. Ridge shifted the backpack higher on his shoulder. Inside 2 blankets, half a loaf of bread, a water bottle, a folded rain poncho, and the small tin of matches he'd grabbed from the kitchen drawer without really thinking about it. He hadn't planned for this. He'd known for 3 weeks that something was wrong, the way Doyle had stopped meeting his eyes at dinner, the way he'd started making phone calls in the truck with the windows rolled up, but he hadn't let himself believe it would come to this. He believed it now. He looked back once at the house. A single light burned in the kitchen window. No shadow moved behind it. Doyle had said his piece. "I can barely survive myself, Ridge. You understand that I've got nothing left to give." And that was apparently all there was to say. 4 months since he'd taken them in. 4 months of awkward meals and short answers and the particular silence of a man counting down the days until he could be alone again. Ridge turned away from the house. He reached down and took Wren's hand. "Come on," he said. "We're going." Where, he didn't have an answer for that, so he just started walking toward the trees. The logging road began at the far edge of a cattle gate that hadn't been locked in years. Ridge lifted the rusted latch, pushed Wren through first, then followed. The gate groaned behind them on its hinges. The sound faded quickly under the noise of wind moving through the upper canopy, a low, constant sound, like something breathing at a distance. The road itself was 2 tire tracks pressed into the earth, running straight for maybe a quarter-mile before curving left and disappearing behind a ridge of Douglas fir. The ground was soft from last week's rain. Their boots left clear prints in the mud. Ridge noted that and said nothing about it. They walked. The light dropped steadily. What had been gray afternoon became purple dusk, and then something darker than that, the kind of dark that settles in old-growth forest before the moon is fully up. Ridge had a flashlight in the bottom of the backpack, but he didn't want to use it yet. Light in the trees at night was visible from a long way off. He wasn't sure why that mattered, but it did. Wren stumbled on a root hidden under dead needles, and Ridge caught him without breaking stride. "You okay?" "My feet hurt." "I know. How much farther are we going?" Ridge looked ahead into the dark corridor of pines. The road curved again up ahead, climbing slightly toward what he thought might be a low ridge. He had no real idea what was beyond it. He'd lived in this county for 4 months and had driven through this stretch of forest exactly twice, both times in the dark in the back of Doyle's truck. "Far enough that nobody sends us away again," he said. Wren didn't answer that. He just tightened his grip on Ridge's hand and kept walking. The temperature dropped faster than Ridge expected. October in the Oregon Cascades did that warm enough during the day that you forgot cold enough at night to remind you. He could feel it seeping through his jacket now, working through the collar, settling at the back of his neck. He thought about the blankets in the backpack and calculated. If they didn't find shelter before full dark, he'd have to make a decision about the blankets and the poncho and whether they could survive a night on the open road. He did not let himself think about what happened to hypothermic 7-year-olds. They had been walking for close to 2 hours when the road curved sharply around a stand of old-growth fir and Ridge stopped without meaning to. He'd caught something in his peripheral vision, not movement, more like an absence, a gap in the tree line where the darkness was slightly different, slightly more open, as if the forest had pulled back from something. He turned slowly. Through the trees, maybe 80 yards off the road, a shape sat in the darkness. Low, rectangular, man-made. He stood very still and watched it for a long moment. No lights, no sound, no sign of smoke or movement. Just a structure small and dark and silent, almost swallowed by the pine trees around it. "What is it?" Wren whispered. "I don't know yet." "Is someone in there?" "I don't think so." He pushed through the brush at the road's edge, holding branches back for Wren. The ground between the trees was soft and deep with decades of fallen needles. Somewhere to the left, water moved over rocks, a sound he filed away without stopping. They came up on the structure slowly, and as they got closer, Ridge's eyes adjusted enough to begin making out details. A cottage, small, one-story, maybe 400 square feet at most. The roof sagged badly on the left side, pressed down by the weight of a fallen branch that must have come down years ago. One of the two front windows was broken, the glass gone entirely, the opening covered with what looked like a sheet of brittle plastic that had long since cracked and pulled away from the frame. Wild ivy climbed the east wall almost to the roofline. But the walls were standing, and the door, a heavy wooden door with a black iron handle, was still in its frame. Ridge put his hand flat on the door and pushed. The wood caught on the floor as it opened, scraping loudly across what he could feel more than see was bare plank. A wave of cold air came out from the dark interior. It smelled of old wood and ash, and something underneath both of those things, a kind of stillness like air that hasn't moved in a very long time. Wren pressed close behind him. Neither of them stepped inside immediately. Ridge clicked on the flashlight. One room. A narrow kitchen counter built along the back wall. A small iron stove near the center of the space, with a tin chimney pipe running up through the roof. Two wooden chairs. A low shelf along one wall empty except for a few mason jars. A folded wool blanket on the seat of one of the chairs. A kerosene lantern hanging from a nail beside the broken window. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but the stove Ridge noted was intact, and beside it in the shadows between the iron legs and the wall was a small stack of split firewood. Not much, 6 or 8 pieces, but dry. Someone had lived here. Someone had left that wood. He crossed the floor, carefully testing each board before putting his full weight on it. The wood creaked but held. He knelt beside the stove and opened the small cast iron door. Inside, old ash, cold and gray, the remnants of a fire that had burned out so long ago, there was no smell left to it. He checked the tin near the side of the stove. Inside, a small collection of matchbooks, some bent, some loose. He pulled one out and tried to straighten it. He would need tinder. He looked around the floor, found a few dry pine needles that had blown in under the door, some shreds of old newspaper wedged beneath the shelf. He built it carefully, the way his father had shown him once on a camping trip he barely remembered. Now newspaper first, needles on top, then the smallest piece of kindling balanced above that. He struck the first match. It snapped in half. He took a breath and tried the second one. The flame caught but died instantly in the draft from the broken window. He turned slightly, blocking the air with his shoulder, and tried the third. The flame held. For 3 seconds he watched it, barely breathing. Then it found the edge of the newspaper and spread. He fed the fire slowly, one small piece at a time, until the kindling caught, and the first real log began to darken and smoke, and then finally burn. Weak orange light filled the small room and pushed the darkness back toward the corners. Behind him, Wren had found the wool blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. He was sitting in one of the chairs watching the fire through the open stove door, and for the first time since Doyle had opened the front door of his house and said what he said, something in his face had loosened slightly. Ridge sat back on his heels and let himself breathe. Outside, the forest continued its long conversation with the wind. By morning, the stove had burned down to a handful of coals. Ridge woke before Wren, as he always did, and lay still for a moment on the floor, listening to the sounds of the place. Wind, birds somewhere high in the canopy, the distant sound of water. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The cold was sharp and clean. The forest floor was still dark in the deep shadows, but the sky between the trees had gone pale gray with early light. His breath came out in small clouds. He stood on the narrow porch, just four boards really nailed across a pair of old joists, and looked at what the dark had hidden the night before. The cottage sat in a shallow clearing, maybe half an acre of open ground, before the trees closed in again. To the left of the structure, a rusted metal roof had collapsed over what might once have been a small shed or storage building. Beyond it, running along the tree line, a wooden fence. Most of the posts still stood, though the wire between them had long since snapped and coiled back on itself. And in the space between the fence and the collapsed shed, just visible beneath a thick mat of dead grass and overgrowth, were lines. Straight lines, deliberate spacing, garden rows. Ridge walked to the fence line and crouched down, pushing aside the dead grass with one hand. Beneath it, he could feel the edge of a raised bed soil that had been worked at some point, turned and amended, not just left to pack down the way forest ground did. Someone had built this. Probably many times, probably over many years. He stood and walked the fence line slowly, reading the ground, the way his father had once read roads in bad weather, looking for what the surface was telling him about what lay beneath. At the far end of the garden space, near where the fence curved back toward the cottage, he found a flat piece of ground that felt different underfoot. Hollow almost. He knelt and pulled away a layer of dead leaves and pine needles. Boards, rotten at the edges but boards, set into the ground deliberately. He pulled the first one up. It was heavier than it looked, swollen with old moisture. The second one came away in two pieces. Beneath them, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. He didn't have the flashlight with him. He went back to the cottage, got it checked on Wren, still asleep, curled into the chair with the blanket pulled up to his chin, and came back to the opening in the ground. The stairs descended maybe 6 feet. The room at the bottom was roughly square, the walls built from flat stones mortared together. The ceiling was low enough that Ridge had to tilt his head forward. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls. Most were empty. A few dusty mason jars with unidentifiable contents. A cluster of old potatoes too far gone to eat, shrunken and soft. A tin cup hanging from a nail. And at the back of the room, where the stone of one wall had been left rougher than the others, water came out. Not a drip, not a seep. A genuine flow, thin but constant, emerging from a natural crack in the rock and running down into a shallow basin that someone had built from flat stones mortared in place. The basin overflowed into a channel cut into the earthen floor, which disappeared under the far wall. Ridge knelt beside it and put his fingers in the flow. Cold. Very cold. He cupped his hands and drank. It was clean. He could taste the limestone it had come through, faintly mineral the way good spring water tasted. He drank again. Then he sat back on his heels in the dim underground room and looked at the spring and the stone shelves and the low ceiling and felt something shift inside his chest. They had water. They had shelter. The stove worked. The garden ground had been cultivated before and could be again. He thought of Wren upstairs in the chair and made a decision. They were staying. He was halfway back up the stairs when his light caught something he had missed in the dark. Set into the base of the stone wall beneath the lowest shelf, almost entirely hidden by the shadow of the shelf above it, a shape. He stopped, crouched down, moved the light closer. A metal box, perhaps 12 inches long, 8 inches wide. The surface was dull and dark with age. It had been sealed. He could see the line of solder running around the seam and set into a shallow depression in the earth, as if it had been placed there, deliberately pressed down into the ground, and then the dirt packed around it. He reached for it, stopped. On the lid, scratched into the metal with something sharp, a nail maybe or a knife point, were 2 letters. R and W. Ridge stared at them for a long time. The spring ran quietly in the corner. Somewhere above him in the cottage, Wren was sleeping. R and W. His name, his brother's name. He picked up the box. It was heavier than he expected. He could feel something shifting inside when he tilted it papers maybe, or something wrapped in cloth. The solder seal was old but held. He would need a tool to open it without damaging whatever was inside. He carried it upstairs and set it on the kitchen shelf and sat down across from it and looked at it until Wren woke up. The days that followed had a particular quality that Ridge would think about later, a kind of compressed intensity where each hour demanded something from him, and there was no space left over for anything except the task immediately in front of him. Which was, he realized, probably the point. When there's no margin, there's no time to be afraid. He found tools in the wreckage of the collapsed shed. A hand axe with a cracked handle still functional, a shovel with a bent blade, a rusted splitting maul, a coil of wire that was still usable in sections. He repaired the handle of the axe with a length of hickory branch and a strip of rubber from the rotted inner tube he found in the corner of the shed. It wasn't pretty, it worked. Every morning he was in the forest before the light was fully up, looking for standing dead timber trees that had died on their feet, dried out from the inside, the best firewood in the world if you could find it. He dropped them with the axe and limbed them on the ground and dragged the sections back to the cottage by hand. Wren, to his credit, didn't just sit. He stacked. He carried smaller pieces. He collected pine cones and dry needles that could start a fire in 30 seconds if you needed them to. The creek Ridge had heard that first night was about 300 yards south of the cottage, running fast and cold over a gravel bed. He found it on the second morning and came back with two small cutthroat trout that he'd caught with his hands in a shallow pool behind a rock, a trick his father had showed him that he'd never believed would work until it did. That night he cooked them over the stove with wild onions he'd pulled from the edge of the garden, and the cottage smelled for the first time like something other than dust and old ash. Wren ate his portion without a word and then sat looking at the empty tin plate for a moment. "That was good," he said finally. Ridge said nothing, but something loosened in his chest. On the third day he found the orchard. He'd been following the fence line farther than he'd gone before tracing it east, where it disappeared into heavier timber when the trees opened unexpectedly into a clearing that the forest had been slowly working to reclaim. Old apple trees, maybe 30 of them, planted in rough rows that were still visible despite decades of untended growth. The branches had gone wild, crossing each other, reaching in every direction, the bark dark with moss. Most of the fruit had fallen and rotted, but not all of it. He spent an hour moving through the trees, checking each one, filling his jacket with every apple that was still firm. Small ones, most of them, tart and dense. Not eating apples by preference, but food, real food. At the far end of the clearing, a single tree stood apart from the others, a walnut old massive, its canopy spreading 20 feet in every direction. The ground beneath it was deep in shells, most of them empty, cracked open by squirrels, and left in drifts against the exposed roots. But under the leaves closer to the trunk, Ridge found intact ones. He cracked one against a root, and the meat inside was pale and whole and clean. He filled the pockets of his jacket and made 2 more trips that afternoon. That evening, while the apples roasted in the tin pan on top of the stove, and the walnuts dried on the shelf above the firewood, the cottage was warmer than it had been since they had arrived. The smell was good. Wren sat close to the stove with his blanket and watched the apples and didn't say much. Ridge sat across from him and looked at the metal box on the shelf. R&W. He had thought about it every day since he'd found it. He'd turned it over, examined the solder seam, tapped it, held it up to the light through the window. He hadn't tried to open it yet. He'd told himself it was because he hadn't found the right tool. But that wasn't entirely true. He was afraid of what he would feel when he did. The next morning, he found more of the collapsed shed and pulled apart a section of framing that had survived the fall. Under the boards, half buried in pine needles, was a flat pry bar, rusted but solid. He didn't take it inside right away. He spent the morning doing other things, checking the garden beds, reinforcing the patch he'd put over the broken window with a piece of plywood from the shed, collecting water from the underground spring. He worked steadily and without conversation, and let the day move forward the way it needed to. It was afternoon when he finally came inside, set the pry bar on the table beside the metal box, and sat down. Wren looked up from the floor where he was sorting walnuts. Are you going to open it? Yeah. Now. Yeah. He worked the pry bar into the solder seam carefully, not forcing it. The seal was old and came apart in sections, the solder crumbling rather than breaking. When he'd worked his way around three sides, he set the bar down and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept the moisture out, were three things. A photograph, black and white printed on thick paper stock, the edges slightly worn. A man standing in front of this cottage, or a version of it years ago, when the roof was whole and the garden was tended, and someone had planted a row of something along the porch edge that Ridge couldn't identify from the dried stalk. The man was maybe 70, lean, wearing work clothes, not looking at the camera but at something off to the right. His expression was unreadable. A folded piece of paper. Ridge opened it and found a hand-drawn map, not to scale but detailed. The cottage was marked at the center, the creek to the south, the orchard to the east, and in the northwest corner of the map, marked with a small X, and the notation under the hearthstone, something Ridge hadn't found yet. And a document. Multiple pages folded together, the paper heavier and more formal than the other items. Ridge unfolded it carefully. It was a property deed. 40 acres in Cascade County, Oregon. The legal description ran for half a page in the dense language that those documents used. But the name at the top was clear. Gerald Harding. Ridge read it twice, then once more. Harding. His name. His father's name. His grandfather's name. The grandfather Doyle had always described as a man who'd gone off on his own decades ago, cut ties, wasn't interested in family anymore. He chose the forest over us, Doyle had said once in the flat, way he said things that weren't open for discussion. Some people are built that way. Ridge sat very still with the deed in his hands and looked at the photograph of the old man standing in front of this cottage. He looked at the set of his shoulders, the way he stood on the ground he was standing on, like he'd earned it, like he'd built everything around him and wasn't finished yet. Gerald Harding, his grandfather. Wren had gone very quiet on the floor. Ridge could feel him watching but didn't look up. The oilcloth inside the box contained one more thing he hadn't seen yet, a folded piece of paper smaller than the deed with no formal header. A letter. Handwritten in a careful, even hand that had gotten slightly less even toward the bottom of the page, as if the writer had been tired or hurting, or both. If you found this, you came far enough. That's the first thing I needed to know. Ridge stopped reading, started over, read it again. I spent a long time deciding how much to write here and how much to leave for the other place. I'll keep this short. This land is yours by right, not by my choice, by law. Your father's name is on the deed from 1987. What came after that, what was done with my name after I was gone, those are things you'll need to find out on your own. But everything you need is here in this place if you're willing to work for it. I watched from farther away than I should have. I know that. There are reasons I'll explain when you find the rest of this. When you find the rest of this. The letter ended there, mid-page, the last line written, and then nothing, not a signature, not a sign-off, just the sentence hanging in the air above the blank space below it. When you find the rest of this, there was more. Somewhere in this cottage, in this land, Gerald Harding had left something else. A second letter, more information, something hidden more carefully than the box in the cellar. Ridge looked at the map, the X in the northwest corner, under the hearthstone. He looked at the iron stove in the center of the room. He'd been living beside it for days, feeding it wood, banking its coals at night, building his world around its warmth without once thinking about what was under the stone it sat on. He almost moved it then. But it was past midday, and the temperature was dropping, and they needed the heat, and there were still things to do before dark. He set the letter back in the box, set the box on the highest shelf, and went back outside. He had been chopping firewood near the east fence line for about 20 minutes when he stopped. The sound he heard was small, barely there, distinct. He turned slowly and looked south along the fence. In the mud beside the fence post, 6 feet from where the post curved toward the cottage, was a footprint. Not his, not Wren's. A boot print full size pressed deep into the wet ground the way a heavy adult pressing hard into soft earth made it press. The tread was clear, and the direction of travel Ridge crouched and read it the way his father had taught him to read tracks, looking at the displacement and the pressure points, was from the cottage outward. Toward the road, someone had been here. Not before them. The print was too recent for that. The edges were still clean, not softened by rain or wind, and it had rained 2 nights ago. This had been made sometime in the last 48 hours. While they were here, Ridge stood and looked toward the tree line in every direction. The forest stood still and dark and said nothing. He thought about the letter. When you find the rest of this. He thought about Doyle. He went back to the cottage without finishing the firewood and checked every window and every wall, and then found a length of wire and looped it through the door latch and wrapped it twice around the iron hook on the frame. Not a lock, a delay. That night he sat with his back against the wall where he could see both the door and the window, and he listened to the forest settle into its darkness, and he thought about a man named Gerald Harding, who had lived alone in these trees for the last years of his life, with one eye always on the road. Wren slept. The stove burned low. Outside, the pines moved in the wind, their crowns sweeping slow arcs across a sky thick with stars. Ridge did not sleep for a long time. He sat with the letter on his knee and read the last line again over and over until the fire burned completely down. When you find the rest of this. He was going to find it. Whatever it was, wherever it was hidden, he was going to find it. Because a man who had gone to this much trouble, who had built a cellar and sealed a box and carved initials into the lid and written a letter with a shaking hand in what Ridge suspected were the last months of his life, that man had not been hiding from his family. That man had been protecting something. And now Ridge Harding was the only person left who could figure out what. The first snow came 12 days after they found the cottage. Ridge saw it coming before it arrived. He'd been watching the sky for 3 days, the way the clouds moved in from the northwest in a particular formation, low and dense, and the color of old pewter. The way the temperature had dropped, not gradually but in steps each morning, colder than the last by a margin that felt deliberate. His father had known weather the way some men knew card games by instinct and long observation, and Ridge had absorbed enough of that to recognize the signs even if he couldn't always name them. He spent 2 full days preparing. He pulled every board he could salvage from the collapsed shed and carried them to the roof, climbing carefully on the sagging left side where the fallen branch had compressed the structure over years of slow pressure. He worked the branch free in sections, cutting through the smaller limbs with the hand axe and levering the main trunk away from the roof line with the pry bar. Beneath it, the damage was less than he'd feared. The rafters had bent, but not broken. He shored them up with lengths of the straightest timber he could find, nailing them in place with old nails he'd pulled from the shed framing and straightened against the hearthstone. The hearthstone. He'd moved the stove twice since finding the map. The first time 3 days after finding the box, he dragged it aside and examined every inch of the stone beneath. The stone was a single flat piece of granite roughly 2 feet by 3, set into the floor with its edges mortared. He'd found nothing. No seam, no hollow sound when he knocked. He'd moved the stove back confused and spent 2 days wondering if he'd misread the map. The second time he'd brought the pry bar and worked more carefully, testing the mortar around the edges, looking for the place where the seal was different. He found it on the north side, a 2-inch section where the mortar was slightly lighter in color, slightly newer, applied over a gap that had been opened and resealed. He worked the bar into it. The mortar crumbled. The edge of the stone lifted. Beneath it was a space, not large, perhaps 8 inches deep, in the size of a shoebox, but empty. Whatever had been there was gone. He'd knelt beside the open space for a long time, looking at the shape of it, the way the earth at the bottom had been disturbed and resettled. Something had been here and had been removed. By Gerald, maybe moved somewhere else in those last months, or by someone who'd come after. The footprint by the fence. He'd filled the space back in and replaced the mortar with a mixture of ash and fine clay. from the creek bank, smoothed it down, moved the stove back, and said nothing to Wren. Now with the snow coming, he pushed all of that aside and focused on what he could control. He stacked firewood against the cottage wall under a lean-to he built from shed boards and a length of old tin roofing. He chinked the gaps in the walls with a mixture of pine resin and clay that he'd watched harden to something approaching solid over 2 days of dry weather. He reinforced the plastic over the broken window with boards nailed in a grid pattern that let in some light but kept out the wind. He dug the rain barrel deeper into the ground on the south side of the cottage and covered the top with a board weighted by a stone so the overflow from the roof gutter would still reach it, but ice forming on the surface wouldn't crack the drum. He did these things methodically without hurry, working from first light until he couldn't see anymore. And when he was done each evening, he sat with Wren by the stove, and they ate whatever there was and didn't talk about what was coming. The snow arrived at night the way serious storms often did quietly. At first, the sound of it against the roof barely distinguishable from rain, until you looked out and saw the darkness had changed. Ridge woke at some point past midnight and lay still listening to the new sound the wind made when it was carrying snow. He got up and added wood to the stove and checked the door latch and the window boards and went back to the floor and lay there with his eyes open until morning. The storm lasted 2 days. On the first day, the snow was deep enough by noon that the tree line had blurred into a white wall, and the clearing around the cottage had ceased to be recognizable as a clearing. Ridge went out twice to clear snow from the lean-to roof before the weight could damage it, and each time came back inside, moving stiffly, with cold standing over the stove until his fingers worked again. Wren stayed inside and sorted the walnut stock by size and condition, discarding the ones that had gone soft, counting the remainder, stacking them in the tin containers Ridge had found in the cellar. On the morning of the second day, Wren didn't get up. Ridge noticed first because Wren was always up before him, some internal clock. The boy ran on that had nothing to do with the sun. He turned and looked at the chair where Wren slept, wrapped in both blankets, and saw the boy lying absolutely still, with his eyes closed and his face pale in a way that was different from sleep. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hand on Wren's forehead. The heat hit him like a wall. He worked fast and quietly the way he'd learned to do things that frightened him without letting the fear into the movements themselves. He built the fire higher. He filled the tin cup with spring water and held Wren's head up and got him to drink, which took several minutes of patient coaxing. He stripped off Wren's outer layer and checked him for signs of anything obvious. No cuts, no swelling, nothing he could see. Fever. Likely from the cold and the damp and the accumulated exhaustion of 3 weeks of sleeping on a chair in an uninsulated cottage in the Oregon Cascades. He knew what his mother would have done. He'd watched her do it once when he was 8 and Wren was 3, and a chest cold had turned frightening overnight. She'd gone to the kitchen and come back with things he couldn't name then and still couldn't name exactly now. Something she'd dried from the garden the previous fall, steeped in hot water given in small amounts. He remembered the smell of it, something bitter under something green. He couldn't recreate that, but he knew where to look. He pulled on every layer he had wrapped his face with the extra shirt from his pack and went out into the storm. The creek was a quarter-mile south through what was now knee-deep snow in the open areas, though less in the shelter of the trees. He moved as fast as he could without exhausting himself, knowing that exhaustion in this cold was its own danger. Along the creek bank, he found what he was looking for, on the underside of a snow-covered shelf of rock-dried yarrow stalks, the flower heads brown and compressed but intact, still carrying the compound that reduced fever. He'd learned that from a book his father had kept on the shelf, a field guide to plants of the Pacific Northwest that he'd read 3 times out of boredom one winter. He collected what he could reach, took also a handful of dried rose hips from a bush he spotted on the way back, and returned to the cottage in 40 minutes. He steeped both in hot water for as long as he could stand to wait. The resulting liquid was bitter and dark. He sweetened it with a thin scraping from one of the dried apple slices they'd been saving and got Wren to drink it in small sips every hour through the rest of the day. By evening, the fever had not worsened. By morning, it had dropped. Wren woke on the 3rd day and asked for water in a voice like dry paper, and then asked what had happened, and Ridge told him he'd been sick and was better now. Wren accepted this without drama, which was characteristic of him in a way that Ridge had always quietly admired. "It stopped snowing," Wren said, looking at the window. "Yeah. Can we go outside later?" The world that emerged from the storm was white and completely still. The clearing looked like something from a painting. Every surface coated every branch, holding its own small weight of snow. The sky above scrubbed clean to a pale winter blue that was almost painful to look at. Ridge stood on the porch with his breath clouding around him and felt for one brief moment that particular sensation of the world having been made new. Then he looked at the fence line. The snow south of this fence was unbroken, west unbroken, north where the road ran unbroken. But on the east side along the fence that separated the cottage clearing from the direction of the orchard, the snow was not unbroken. There were tracks, boot tracks coming from the east following the fence line to a point about 30 feet from the cottage corner, then stopping, then returning the way they'd come. Recent, made after the snow stopped, which meant sometime in the last 12 hours. Ridge stood on the porch and looked at those tracks for a long time. Whoever had made them had stopped at the same point both ways 30 feet from the cottage corner and had stood there long enough to compress the snow into a hard pad. Looking at the cottage, watching maybe for smoke from the chimney or light from the window or any sign that someone was inside. Ridge went back into the cottage and told Wren to stay inside for the rest of the day, and when Wren asked why, Ridge said there was ice and he didn't want him slipping. Wren accepted this also without drama, which meant he probably knew it wasn't entirely true. That afternoon with Wren, occupied with the walnuts, Ridge worked on the cottage quietly and steadily and thought about the tracks. They were too purposeful to be random. Someone knew this property. Someone was checking it with regularity before the storm and after. Someone who knew to come from the east through the orchard where the tree cover was thickest and the approach was least visible from the road. He thought about what Gerald had written. What came after that? What was done with my name after I was gone? Those are things you'll need to find out on your own. He thought about Doyle's face the last 3 weeks before he'd opened the door. The way he'd started making phone calls in the truck with the windows rolled up. The way he'd stopped meeting Ridge's eyes. Those are things you'll need to find out on your own. Ridge opened the metal box and read the letter again slowly, and then read the deed again, line by line, paying attention to everything he'd skimmed before. The property description, the date, the names in the margins that he hadn't understood the first time, a notary's name, a witness signature, a recording number. Gerald Harding had registered this deed formally with the county in 1987. That meant it was a matter of public record. That meant anyone who knew what they were looking for could find it, or could find that it existed and know that someone else might find it. 3 days later, in the thin, hard cold of a November morning, Ridge was splitting wood near the lean-to when he heard the car. He heard it before he saw it, the sound of tires on frozen gravel moving slowly, the particular sound of a vehicle that wasn't in a hurry because it didn't need to be. He set the axe down and moved to the corner of the cottage and looked north toward the road. A black pickup truck sat at the edge of the tree line where the old fence gate opened onto the logging road. 2 men got out. One of them, Ridge recognized immediately by the way he moved that particular combination of deliberate and unhurried, like a man who had made up his mind about something and was simply executing a plan. Doyle Harding. The other man carried a leather document case and wore a coat that was too thin for the weather, the kind of coat people who spent their days inside wore when they had to go outside. He was already looking at his phone. Ridge didn't move from the corner of the cottage. He watched them come through the gate and cross the clearing toward him, and he kept his face still and his hands visible, and he waited. Doyle stopped 10 feet away and looked at the cottage and at the stacked firewood and at the repaired roof and at the cleared garden and then finally at Ridge. Something moved across his face that Ridge couldn't quite read. It was not surprise exactly. It was closer to confirmation. "I thought you'd still be here," Doyle said. "This is where we live." "No," Doyle said it simply without heat. "It's not." He turned to the man with the document case. "Go ahead." The man opened the case and removed a folded packet of papers and held it out. Ridge didn't take it. The man set it on the lean-to shelf instead. That's a court order, Doyle said. Property deed notarized will recorded with the county last March. Gerald Harding left this property to me in his will. That's legal documentation of transfer of ownership witnessed and filed. Ridge said nothing. There's a 30-day notice of vacancy in there. That means you have 30 days to clear out. I'm not a bad man, Ridge. I gave you the time because winter's coming, and I didn't want... You gave us a 30-day notice because it's the legal minimum. Doyle looked at him. And you waited until the first snow, Ridge said, because you thought by now we'd have given up and left already. Doyle's jaw tightened slightly. Then he looked at the cottage again with a different expression, calculating, Ridge thought, looking at what had been done to the place, the repaired roof, the firewood, the cleared garden. Gerald didn't leave you anything, Doyle said. He didn't ask about you, not once in all those years. He chose this place over his own family, and when he died, he left it to me because I was the one who dealt with his affairs. Ridge looked at his uncle and thought about the metal box on the shelf inside, about the oilcloth, about the deed with Gerald Harding's name on it dated 1987, and the letter written in a careful hand and the two initials scratched into the lid of a sealed box, R and W. He said nothing. Doyle held his gaze for a moment, then turned away. He spoke to the man with the document case, quietly, something Ridge couldn't hear, and then walked back toward the gate without looking at the cottage again. At the gate he stopped, didn't turn around. 30 days, he said. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The truck backed out onto the road and drove away. The sound of the engine faded into the trees. The clearing was silent again, except for the wind and the creak of frozen branches. Ridge stood at the corner of the cottage and looked at the packet of papers on the shelf and felt something settle inside him. Not fear, not anger. Something colder and more useful than either of those. He picked up the packet and went inside. Wren looked up from the floor. Was that Doyle? Yeah. What did he want? Ridge sat down at the table and opened the packet and began to read it carefully from the first page to the last. The will was dated March of this year, 1 month after Gerald Harding died. He wants the land, Ridge said. Is it his? Ridge set the last page down and looked at his brother. No, he said, it's not. That night after Wren was asleep, Ridge pulled the metal box down from the shelf and took everything out and laid it on the table. The photograph, the deed, the partial letter, the hand-drawn map with the X over the hearthstone. The hearthstone had been empty, cleared out. He'd assumed Gerald had moved the contents. But now, looking at the map again in the flat light of the kerosene lantern he'd gotten working 2 weeks ago, he noticed something he'd missed before. There were 2 X marks. He'd seen the one over the hearthstone clearly, but in the lower right corner of the map, barely visible because it overlapped with the edge of the paper where Gerald's pen had been running out of ink, was a second mark. Smaller, placed at a point inside the cottage that Ridge traced with his finger along the wall, the north wall behind the kitchen counter. He crossed the room and stood in front of the kitchen counter. He'd used it as a shelf for the last 3 weeks without thinking about what was under it. It was built into the wall boards, nailed to cleats, not freestanding, the back panel flush against the wall planks. He pushed the contents aside and began to feel along the wall behind the counter, pressing each board in turn. Near the left end toward the corner, one board gave slightly under pressure. Not much, a 1/4 inch maybe, but different from the others. He worked the pry bar into the gap at the board's edge and levered carefully. The board came away from the wall with a sound like an intake of breath, a rush of cold air from the space behind it, and then a soft thud as something fell from the space behind it onto the floor. A cloth bundle, dark fabric oilcloth, again tied with a length of wax string, heavy for its size. Ridge picked it up and set it on the counter and untied the string and unfolded the oilcloth. Inside was a document, multiple pages formal, the same heavy paper stock as the deed. He unfolded it and read the header. Warranty deed, Cascade County, Oregon. Recorded 1987. His hands were very still on the paper. This was not the same document as the one in the metal box. That one had been a copy good paper, carefully preserved, but a copy. This was the original recording. The stamp of the county recorder's office was embossed into the lower left corner. The signature of the notary public was original ink. The signature of the grantor was original ink. And below the property description in the section that named the grantee, the person to whom the land was being conveyed was not Gerald Harding's name. It was Thomas Harding, Ridge's father. Gerald Harding had transferred title to this property to his son Thomas in 1987. This was the original instrument of that transfer, recorded and stamped and legally binding, predating any subsequent document by more than 30 years. Any will Doyle had filed in March of this year, any document Doyle had recorded, any notarized instrument, any court filing came after this, was subordinate to this. The land had belonged to Thomas Harding. Thomas Harding had died intestate without a will, which under Oregon law meant his estate passed to his heirs, his children, Ridge Harding and Wren Harding. There was something else in the oilcloth. A letter longer this time, more pages the handwriting, the same careful hand as the first one, but fuller, the sentences longer, as if this one had been written when there was more time. Ridge, I need you to understand why I did things the way I did. Not to excuse it, to explain it, which is different. I knew Doyle was watching. I knew that after I was gone, he would move quickly. He has always known about this property. I was not careful enough about that years ago, and I have carried the weight of that mistake for a long time. I could not fight him directly. I am an old man, and he has resources I never had, and the kind of patience that patient, greedy people have. So I hid the original deed where he would not find it. He found the box in the cellar, I know that, because I set a marker there, a thread, and when I came back one last time, it had been disturbed. He took what was inside. He thought that was all there was. He does not know about the wall. Your father was a good man, Ridge. He was not a man who accumulated things or held on to what he had. He might have given this land away if someone had asked him the right way at the right moment. That is one of the things I loved about him, and one of the things that kept me awake at night. So I kept the original deed here instead of with him. He knew I had it. We agreed, the two of us, that the land would stay in trust this way until it was needed. I never imagined it would be needed like this. I never imagined you would be the one to come looking for it. I watched from a distance and I told myself you were all right, that Doyle had some decency left in him, that I was wrong to worry. I was wrong to not worry sooner. The deed is the original instrument. It is sufficient. Take it to someone who knows what it means. There is a man in Millhaven. His name is Sylvester Gran. He has an office on the main street above the hardware store. He is nearly retired and not easy to deal with, but he knew me and he knows the law, and he will understand immediately what you are holding. You found this place. You stayed when it was cold and when it was hard, and when someone came to the door and told you that you didn't belong here. That is all I needed to know about you. The rest of what I have to tell you is not something I can put in a letter, but it will find its way to you. I made sure of that also. Stay. G.H. Ridge read the letter twice. Then he folded it very carefully and placed it back in the oilcloth with the deed and wrapped the whole bundle and set it in the metal box and closed the lid. He looked at the stove, at the chimney pipe going up through the roof he'd repaired with his own hands, at the shelf where the walnut supply sat and counted rows, at the window he'd covered and sealed against the coming winter, at the door he'd wired shut each night to buy himself 30 seconds if he needed it. 25 days. That was what Doyle had left him. 25 days from the morning of the visit. Ridge thought about the 6 miles between this cottage and the town of Millhaven. He'd seen it on the county map, the one road heading west through the trees, coming out on the highway, the cluster of buildings that constituted a town in this part of Oregon. He'd never been there. He'd been off this property exactly twice since arriving, both times just to the creek and back. 6 miles in November in the Cascades. Not impossible. Not comfortable either. He thought about Wren. He thought about the cottage and the firewood stack and the food supply and what 3 weeks of hard preparation had built here and what Doyle's lawyers would do to all of it if Ridge walked away from it now. He was not walking away. He closed the metal box and pushed it to the back of the shelf and blew out the lantern and lay down on the floor in the dark and listened to his brother breathe in the chair and to the forest settle around the cottage in the deep cold of a November night. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go to Millhaven tomorrow. And then he thought of something else. The last line of Gerald's first letter. The rest of what I have to tell you is not something I can put in a letter, but it will find its way to you. I made sure of that also. Something else was coming. Gerald had arranged it. Something that would arrive by some mechanism Ridge didn't understand yet, something that was already in motion. Set in motion by an old man who had known he was dying and had spent whatever time he had left making sure his grandsons would have what they needed when the time came. Ridge stared at the ceiling in the dark. He thought about a man standing in front of a cottage with a rebuilt roof and tended garden rows. Not looking at the camera, looking at something off to the right at the tree line, or the orchard, or the path that led down to the creek. As if he'd heard something there that he recognized. As if he was still listening for something. The morning Ridge walked to Millhaven, the temperature was 11 degrees, and the road through the trees was packed ice under 6 inches of new powder. He left before first light. He'd spent the previous evening preparing for it the way he prepared for everything now, methodically without drama. He stacked enough firewood inside the cottage to last Wren 2 full days. He filled every container they had with spring water and set them near the stove so they wouldn't freeze. He cooked the last of the dried beans with creek water and left them in the covered tin on the stove shelf. He showed Wren how to add wood without letting the fire get too high and made him demonstrate it twice until he did it right. Wren watched all of this with the particular attention he gave to things he understood were serious. How long will you be gone? One day, maybe into the evening. What if you're not back by dark? Then I'm back the next morning. Don't open the door for anyone. Don't go past the fence line. If you hear a car on the road, stay away from the windows. Wren absorbed this. Is Doyle coming back? I don't know. Probably not before the 30 days are up. But I don't know. Okay. Wren sat with the blanket across his lap and looked at the stove. Then, are you going to fix it? I'm going to try. You'll fix it, Wren said. Not encouragement. Just a statement of what he believed, offered plainly the way 7-year-olds offered things they were certain of. Ridge picked up the metal box and tucked it inside his jacket against his chest, inside his outer layer where it was protected from moisture and held tight against his body. He wrapped the oilcloth bundle from the wall separately in the rain poncho and put it in the backpack. Then he looped the wire through the door latch, said goodbye to Wren, and started walking. The road was easy to follow for the first 2 miles, even in the dark, because the tire tracks from Doyle's truck were still visible under the new snow pressed into the ice in a way that would take weeks to disappear. Ridge followed them west, moving at a steady pace that he could maintain for hours without burning out. His father had taught him that too, the difference between fast and sustainable, and how sustainable always won over distance. By the time full light came up, gray through the trees, he was 3 miles out, and the road had widened where it met an older forestry access track, and he could see where the pavement began at the far end of a long, straight stretch through the timber. His feet were cold, but not dangerously so. His hands he kept moving, shifting the backpack straps, flexing his fingers inside his gloves. He thought about Gerald's letter as he walked, the name Sylvester Gran above the hardware store on the main street. He ran through what he would say. Not a speech, he wasn't a speechmaker, but a sequence. The deed first, the letter second. The will Doyle had filed third, presented as the thing that made the other 2 necessary. He didn't know what Gran would say. He didn't know what happened after that. He only knew the next step. The next step was always the only step worth thinking about. Millhaven announced itself as most small Oregon towns did, a gas station first, then a feed store, then the main street materializing out of the trees with its 2 blocks of storefronts and the water tower visible above the roofline at the far end. Ridge walked the main street slowly, reading the signs above the doors. Hardware store on the left halfway down the block. And above it, exactly as Gerald had written, a door set back from the street with a frosted glass panel in black lettering that had been there long enough to start flaking at the edges. S. Grand Attorney at Law. The stairs were narrow and creaked on every step. Ridge knocked on the door at the top. Nothing for a moment. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, the steps of someone who had decided long ago not to hurry for anyone. The door opened. The man who looked at Ridge was perhaps 65, with white hair cut close to his head, and the kind of deeply lined face that came from decades of outdoor weather or decades of difficult work, or Ridge suspected both. He wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold. He looked at Ridge the way people in small towns looked at strangers, not unfriendly, but comprehensive, taking in everything at once. Grand, Ridge said. Who's asking Ridge Harding? Something changed in the old man's face. Not surprise, more like something he'd been waiting for had finally arrived, and he was deciding how he felt about it. Harding, Grand said. Gerald Harding was my grandfather. Grand looked at him for another moment. Then he opened the door wider and stepped back. You'd better come in. The office was small and organized in a way that looked like chaos, but probably wasn't stacks of folders on every surface. But each stack had an order to it, a kind of spatial logic that Ridge could half read. A wood stove in the corner burning steadily. 2 client chairs across from a desk covered in paper. Gran went behind the desk and sat down and looked at Ridge across the stacks. How old are you? 17. Where's the boy, the younger one? Ridge went still. You know about Ren. Gerald talked about both of you, not often, but when he did, he was specific. Gran took his reading glasses off his forehead and set them on the desk. He came to see me last January, said he was making arrangements, told me about the property, the deed situation, what he expected Doyle to do after he was gone. He paused. He told me you'd come eventually. He wasn't certain when. He's been dead since February. I know, I got the call. Gran's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Doyle filed the will in March. I saw the filing. I looked at it, and I knew exactly what it was. He looked at Ridge steadily. I've been waiting. Ridge reached into his jacket and set the metal box on the desk. Then he unslung the backpack and removed the oilcloth bundle and set that beside it. Gran looked at both objects. He reached for the oilcloth bundle first, unwrapped it, and opened the deed. He read it in silence, taking his time running his finger along each line. When he reached the recording stamp, he stopped and looked at it closely, tilting the page toward the window light. He set it down and looked at Ridge. Where was this? Behind the kitchen wall, behind a loose board. And he told you where to look. He left a map and a letter. Gran picked up the deed again. This is the original recorded instrument from 1987. The grantee is Thomas Harding. He set it down again. Thomas was your father. Yes. Thomas died intestate 3 years ago. Gran nodded slowly. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at the deed and at the metal box, and then at Ridge. What Doyle filed in March is a will purportedly signed by Gerald Harding, witnessed and notarized, conveying the property to Doyle Harding. It was recorded after Gerald's death. He paused. But this deed from 1987 conveyed the property to Thomas before any of that. Gerald couldn't will away property he'd already transferred. The 1987 deed takes precedence. Doyle's will, as it pertains to this property, is legally void. Ridge had known this, or believed it, but hearing it stated plainly by someone who knew what they were talking about was different. Something in his chest loosened by a fraction. Can you prove the will is fraudulent? I don't need to prove fraud to establish your ownership. The deed is sufficient on its own. Gran picked up a pen and turned to a legal pad. But fraud would explain how Doyle managed to get a notarized signature on a document signed by a man who, according to his medical records from last November, had significant motor impairment in his hands from a stroke. He looked up. Gerald couldn't have signed his name legibly in the last 4 months of his life. I have his doctor's statement confirming that. I've been holding it since March. Ridge looked at him. You've been building a case. I've been preparing materials, Gran said carefully. In case someone came through that door with what you just put on my desk. He began writing on the legal pad. I'll file a motion to vacate the will on grounds of incapacity and fraud. I'll attach the 1987 deed as the controlling instrument of title. I'll request a hearing before the circuit court. He wrote steadily for a moment. There's also the matter of the timber sale. Ridge leaned forward slightly. Tell me. Gran set the pen down. 3 weeks after Gerald died, Doyle executed a contract with Delworth Timber for the harvest rights on 8 acres in the northeast section of the property. The contract was signed in Doyle's name as property owner. He paused. At that point, Doyle had no legal ownership of the property. The will hadn't even been filed yet. He signed a contract conveying rights to land that wasn't his. How much? The contract was for $42,000. He received the first payment, $18,000, before anyone thought to look at the chain of title. Ridge sat with that for a moment. That's wire fraud. Gran looked at him with something that might have been respect. Among other things, yes. He picked up the pen again. The federal angle complicates Doyle's position considerably. A fraudulent will is a civil matter in Oregon. Wire fraud involving a federal financial transaction is a different category of problem entirely. When can you file? I can have the motion prepared by end of week. The hearing date depends on the court's calendar. Could be 3 weeks, could be 6. He looked at Ridge steadily. How many days does your notice say? 25 days from this morning. I'll file an emergency injunction to suspend the vacancy notice pending the hearing. That stops the clock. He wrote something at the top of his legal pad and circled it. Doyle can't remove you from the property while there's an active title dispute before the court. It's not complicated law. Any judge in this circuit will grant the injunction. Ridge looked at the 1987 deed on the desk, at the recording stamp in the corner, at his father's name in the grantee line written in ink that had lasted 37 years. He planned all of this, Ridge said. Gerald, he planned every piece of it. Gran was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man. He'd been careful his whole life sometimes, too careful in ways that cost him things he shouldn't have lost. He paused. He talked about your father when he came in January, and about you and the boy. He said he'd watched from a distance for years. His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. He said he'd made a mistake that he couldn't fix directly, and so he was going to fix it the only way he had left. Ridge thought about an old man coming to this office in January after a stroke that had taken the use of his hands, sitting across this same desk, making arrangements for people he'd never spoken to directly, fixing from a distance what he hadn't been able to fix up close. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. Gran walked Ridge through the procedural steps for the next hour, what would be filed in what order, what Ridge might be asked to provide, what the hearing would look like. He spoke precisely and without condescension, treating Ridge as someone capable of understanding what he was being told, which Ridge appreciated more than he said. Before Ridge left, Gran opened his desk drawer and removed a manila envelope. He held it, but didn't hand it over immediately. Gerald left this with me in January. He told me to hold it until the title matter was resolved, or until it was clear that it wasn't going to be resolved, and you needed it sooner. He looked at Ridge. Given what you've just put on my desk, I think the condition is met. He held out the envelope. Ridge's name was written on the front in the same hand as the letters he'd found in the cottage. The handwriting was less steady here. The stroke had already taken something from it, but the letters were deliberate, formed carefully one at a time by someone who wanted to be sure they were legible. He didn't open it in the office. He put it inside his jacket next to his chest with the metal box and thanked Gran and went back down the creaking stairs to the street. He opened it outside, standing in the cold beside the hardware store with his back to the wind. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The handwriting was difficult in places, the letters uneven, some words slanting downward as the pen had wavered, but Gerald had written slowly, and Ridge could read every word. Ridge and Wren, I want to tell you things I should have said in person and didn't because I was a coward about it for too long and then I ran out of time. That's the truth. I'm not going to dress it up. Your father was the best thing I ever had a hand in making. He was honest and patient, and he loved your mother in a way that was plain to see from across a room. When they died, I told myself you boys were being looked after. I told myself Doyle had some decency underneath everything else. I was wrong about that, and I knew I was wrong, and I kept telling myself I wasn't. I lived in those trees for 12 years. I want you to know that I chose them partly because I love them and partly because I needed somewhere that Doyle couldn't reach me. I was afraid of him. Not physically. I was afraid of what he would do to the land, to your father's name, to what I'd spent my life building. So I hid. I hid from him and I hid from you, and those are not the same thing, but I did both, and I am sorry for both. When I found out I was dying, I had two choices. I could try to contact you directly, bring you into it, explain everything in person. Or I could set things in place so that if you were the kind of people I believed you were, you would find what you needed without me having to be there. I chose the second because I was still afraid and because I wanted to know. I needed to know that you would fight for it. Not because the land matters more than people, it doesn't, but because a person who will go into a cold forest with nothing and build something from nothing is a person who can be trusted with what I'm leaving behind. You found the box. You found the wall. You're reading this. That's enough. That's more than enough. The orchard needs about 3 years of proper work before it will produce the way it used to. The walnut tree is old, but it will outlast both of you if you treat it right. The spring has never gone dry in all the years I lived there. The soil in the garden rose is good. I worked it for a decade and left it better than I found it. I watched you both from farther away than I had any right to watch from. I know that. I know I don't get to feel good about it. But I watched, and what I saw was enough to make me believe you would find your way here when you needed to, and that when you did, you would stay. Stay. That's all I have left to tell you. Stay and work it and make it what it should have been. I love you both. I should have said it sooner and to your faces, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. Grandpa Gerald. Ridge stood in the cold on the main street of Mill Haven with the letter in his hands and the wind coming off the mountains to the east and the smell of wood smoke from the buildings around him, and he did not move for a long time. He was not someone who cried easily. He hadn't cried when his mother died, hadn't cried when his father died, had stood at both funerals in the particular stillness of someone who has been the responsible one for so long that grief becomes a thing that waits for a private moment that never quite comes. He stood on that sidewalk and let the letter say what it said, and he breathed through it. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope inside his jacket and started the walk back. The hearing was set for the second week of January. In the weeks between, Ridge worked. He went back to Mill Haven once more on a day when the road was passable to sign the documents Grant had prepared and to provide his account of events from the beginning. Grant filed the emergency injunction on a Thursday. The vacancy notice was suspended by Friday morning. When Ridge returned to the cottage that evening and Wren asked what had happened in town, Ridge sat down across from him and told him everything. The deed, the letter, the lawyer, what Doyle had done, what Gerald had done, what the court was going to decide. Wren listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ridge was finished, Wren was quiet for a moment. "So Gerald was our grandpa," he said. "Yeah, but we never met him." "No." Wren thought about this. "Did he know us?" Ridge thought about the letter in the envelope. "About I watched you both from farther away than I had any right to watch from. About the initials scratched into the lid of the metal box. About a man who had spent 12 years alone in the pine trees, making sure that when the time came, his grandsons would have what they needed." "He knew us," Ridge said, "as well as he could from a distance." "That's sad," Wren said. "Yeah," Ridge said. "It is." Wren looked at the stove for a moment. Then, "But he fixed it before he died. He fixed it so we'd be okay." Ridge looked at his brother, 7 years old, sitting in the chair with the blanket across his lap and understanding the essential shape of the thing more clearly than most adults would have. "He did," Ridge said. December passed in the rhythms that Ridge had come to think of as the rhythms of the place itself. Mornings began with fire and water and the inventory of what needed doing that day. He worked the garden beds, even in the cold clearing, the last of the frost-killed weeds, turning the soil in sections, mixing in composted material from the pile behind the shed. He made a second trip to the orchard and spent a day pruning the apple trees. Rough work corrective rather than careful cutting out the dead wood, and the crossing branches trying to open the canopy to light the way he'd read about somewhere a long time ago. The walnut tree he left alone. It didn't need him. He split more firewood than he thought they'd need and stacked it under the extended lean-to he'd built along the cottage's east wall, covering it with the old tin roofing weighted down with stones. He repaired the cellar stairs, replacing the rotted boards one at a time with lumber from the shed framing. He cleaned the mason jars he'd found on the cellar shelves and used them to store the dried goods they'd accumulated: beans, dried apple slices, walnut halves, dried mushrooms he'd found on a fallen log near the creek. Wren had grown in ways that weren't visible in the mirror. Ridge could see it in how he moved through the cottage and the clearing and the garden rows, with a kind of ownership, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with having been somewhere long enough to know it. He collected eggs from the 2 hens Ridge had traded for at a farm 3 miles down the road. 2 eggs a day, not a fortune, but enough to matter. He knew where the good mushrooms grew and which ones to leave alone. He knew how to read the sky the way Ridge had taught him the formations that meant weather was coming, the direction of wind shift that meant temperature drop. He was still 7. He still asked too many questions about things Ridge didn't know how to answer. But he laughed more now than he had in years, and in the evenings when the stove was going and the lantern cast its particular orange light across the walls of the cottage, Ridge would sometimes look at his brother and feel something settle inside him that he couldn't entirely name. Safety, maybe, or something close to it. The hearing was on a Tuesday, the 9th of January. Grant had arranged a ride for Ridge into the county seat from Millhaven, a retired school teacher named Adeline Marsh, who drove a decade-old Subaru and asked no questions beyond whether he wanted the heat on. Ridge sat in the passenger seat and watched the snow-covered mountains through the window and went through the sequence one more time. Not because he was uncertain, because preparation was the only form of confidence he trusted. The county courthouse was a 2-story brick building that looked like it had been built during a period of serious civic optimism and maintained ever since with declining enthusiasm. Inside, the hallways smelled of old paper and radiator heat. Grant met Ridge outside the courtroom door and looked him over. "You all right?" "Yes." "Doyle will be there with his attorney. They'll likely argue that the 1987 deed was subsequently superseded by—" "I know what they'll argue," Ridge said. "Mom, let them." Grant studied him for a moment. Then he almost smiled. "Your grandfather said you'd be like this." "Like what?" "Calm, unreasonably calm for the situation." Ridge said nothing to that. Doyle was already inside when they entered, seated at the respondent's table with a man in a gray suit who had the polished look of someone who billed by the hour and enjoyed doing it. Doyle looked at Ridge when he came through the door. His expression was controlled, but something behind it had changed since November. Something had taken on the particular quality of a man who has checked his position and found it less solid than he'd believed. He knew about the injunction. He knew Grant had filed. He didn't know about the original deed yet. Grant had attached it to the filing, but the full contents of the supporting documents weren't something Doyle's attorney would have emphasized to his client. Ridge watched Doyle's face and saw the moment, about 30 seconds after Ridge sat down, when Doyle noticed the oilcloth bundle on the table in front of Grant. His eyes went to it and stayed there a half-second too long. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Hargrove No Nonsense, in the way that judges who have spent 30 years in small circuit courts became no nonsense. Not theatrical, simply efficient. She read the filing summary without visible reaction, asked a preliminary question about the recording date of the 1987 deed, and made a note. Doyle's attorney went up first. He was good, Ridge gave him that. He laid out the argument smoothly. Gerald Harding had had the right to revise his estate plan. The will was properly notarized and recorded. The 1987 deed represented a transfer that had effectively lapsed when Thomas Harding died without taking possession, and Doyle, as the named beneficiary in the will, was the rightful current title holder. Ridge listened to all of it and kept his hands flat on the table. When it was Grand's turn, the old lawyer stood up with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been in this room more times than the other attorney had been alive professionally. He placed the original 1987 deed on the bench in front of the judge. He placed the medical records documenting Gerald's hand impairment beside it. He placed the Delworth timber contract signed by Doyle before any instrument of title had been recorded in his name beside that. He spoke for 11 minutes. He used no dramatic language. He simply identified each document, explained its legal significance, and connected it to the next one in a chain so clear that the logic of it was essentially inescapable. When he was finished, the judge looked at the documents for a moment. Then she looked at Doyle's attorney. "Counselor, your client executed a commercial timber contract on February 28th of this year, 3 weeks before the will was filed and approximately 6 weeks after the decedent's death. At that time, by what legal authority did your client claim ownership of the property described in that contract?" The attorney began a response. The judge held up one hand. "I'm going to need something more substantive than beneficial expectation under a will not yet filed and not yet adjudicated." The attorney did not have something more substantive. Doyle was watching the judge's face. Ridge watched Doyle. The controlled expression had cracked slightly at the edges, not collapse, but the beginning of it, the first visible sign that the structure wasn't holding. The judge set the Delworth contract down. "I'm vacating the will of Gerald Harding as it pertains to the property described in the 1987 deed on grounds of pre-existing recorded title transfer and substantial evidence of incapacity at the time of signature." She looked at her notes. "I'm also referring the Delworth transaction to the district attorney's office for review under Oregon property fraud statutes and applicable federal wire fraud provisions. That referral is a matter of record as of today." She looked up at the room. "The property at Cascade County Parcel 47-119 belongs to the estate of Thomas Harding to be held in trust for his minor children, Ridge Harding and Wren Harding, until the elder reaches majority." She gathered the documents. "The injunction is made permanent. This matter is closed." She stood. The room stood with her. Ridge sat still for a moment after the sound of the gavel faded. He was aware of Grand beside him gathering papers. He was aware of Doyle's attorney leaning close to Doyle at the other table, speaking in a low, urgent voice. He was aware of the radiator heat and the fluorescent lights and the smell of old paper. He looked at the oilcloth bundle on the table, the deed inside it, his father's name, Gerald's signature. He thought about a logging road and an old gate and 2 boys walking into a forest with nowhere to go. He thought about a third match held carefully out of the draft. He thought about a box with 2 initials scratched into the lid and an old man who had made every arrangement he could think of and then trusted the rest to the people he'd left behind. He stood up and shook Grand's hand and walked out of the courtroom. Spring came to the Cascades in the particular way it came to high country, not all at once but in small daily permissions. The snow retreated up the hillsides. The creek ran fast and brown with snowmelt. The soil in the garden beds thawed from the surface down, and Ridge was in it every morning, turning it and amending it and laying out the rows for the first full planting season. He was 17 years old, and he had 40 acres of Oregon timber in orchard and spring-fed bottomland in his name, or in trust for him, which was the same thing. He had a stone-walled cellar with a spring that had never gone dry. He had a cottage with a repaired roof and a working stove, and walls he'd chinked himself and boards he'd cut, and fitted himself, and a window that was still covered with plywood, but would have glass in it by summer if he could manage the 4-mile trip to the salvage yard in Millhaven. He had a 7-year-old brother who could start a fire in under 2 minutes and knew the difference between edible and poisonous mushrooms, and had recently begun teaching himself to read the creek for signs of fish by watching where the current slowed. In April, Ridge began the orchard. He'd read everything Grant had lent him from the small shelf of agricultural texts in the back of the office. 2 Oregon State Extension guides on apple cultivation and an older book on orchard management that had been written in the 1940s and was better than both of them. He understood now that what he'd done in December was rough corrective pruning necessary, but not sufficient. The real work was in training the new growth, establishing the shape of each tree over time, working with what the tree wanted to do, and redirecting it gradually toward what it needed to do. He worked through the orchard row by row. Wren worked beside him on the rows he could reach, carrying cut wood to the burn pile, clearing the ground beneath each tree of the competing vegetation that had moved in during the years of neglect. They worked without much conversation, the way people work when they know what needs doing, and the doing of it is satisfying on its own terms. On a Saturday in late April, Ridge was on the ladder in the far corner of the orchard when Wren called to him from the walnut tree. "Ridge, come look!" He climbed down and walked over. Wren was standing at the base of the walnut tree looking up, his head tilted back, his hand shading his eyes against the morning light. The branches were fully leafed out, now the new growth of bright, almost luminous green against the darker, older leaves. The canopy spread wide and even in every direction. "Look at how big it is," Wren said. Ridge looked up. He'd spent the whole winter working around this tree, collecting its fallen fruit, pruning the surrounding orchard growth to give it space and light. He'd looked at it every day for 6 months. But standing here now in the April light with the new leaves fully out the tree seemed different. Not larger, he knew its dimensions, but more itself than it had been in any of the cold months. He thought about Gerald's letter. "The walnut tree is old, but it will outlast both of you if you treat it right." "It's been here a long time," Ridge said. "Probably longer than the cottage." Wren put his hand flat on the trunk. The bark was deeply furrowed gray-brown, the texture of old work gloves. "Do you think he used to stand here?" "Yeah," Ridge said. "I think he did. They stood there for a while, both of them looking up through the canopy at the sky visible in pieces between the leaves. Then Wren said quietly, "I wish we could have met him." Ridge thought about January. The courtroom, the gavel, the drive home through the snow in Adeline Marsh's Subaru, with the heat on and the mountains going dark in the window, and Gran's voice on the phone saying simply, "It's done." He thought about the evening he'd come back and sat down with Wren and told him everything, and Wren had said he fixed it before he died. He thought about Gerald coming to Gran's office in January with barely functional hands and writing out instructions and signing what needed signing and leaving an envelope with a name on it in handwriting that had cost him something to produce. "We did," Ridge said. Wren looked at him. "We met him," Ridge said, "just not the way it's usually done." Later that evening, when the light had gone gold and low over the ridge to the west ridge, sat on the porch steps with a cup of water from the spring and looked out across the clearing. The garden rows were visible in the long shadow, straight and dark, turned earth waiting. Smoke moved up from the chimney in a slow, even column. The orchard was a dark shape on the hillside, the apple trees showing their new growth as lighter patches against the older wood. Wren came out and sat beside him on the steps with his own cup. For a while, neither of them said anything. The forest made its evening sounds. Somewhere down by the creek, a bird ridge still hadn't learned the name of made its particular call, 4 notes, the same sequence repeated at intervals. "I've been thinking," Wren said. "About what?" "About the hearthstone, the empty space." Ridge looked at him. "What about it?" "I think Doyle found the box, but not the letter. He took the box, but the letter was in a different place, the wall." Wren held his cup in both hands. "So he thought he had everything, and he didn't." Ridge was quiet for a moment. "That's right. Gerald knew he'd find the box," Wren said. "He planned it that way. He put the copy in the box so Doyle would think he'd found it and stop looking." Ridge looked at his brother. "And then the real one was in the wall," Wren said. "The whole time, waiting." Ridge thought about that, about an old man in his last month's hands that didn't work right, thinking through each piece of it and placing each piece where it needed to be. Not hiding things randomly, hiding them deliberately with knowledge of the person he was hiding them from. He knew Doyle would go for the obvious location, so he made the obvious location a decoy. He knew a frightened, calculating man wouldn't tear apart every wall of a cold cabin on the chance that something else was hidden. He'd take what he found and go. He knew a 17-year-old who loved his brother and had nowhere else to go would stay long enough to find everything. Yeah, Ridge said. That's what he did. The bird called from the creek, 4 notes, the same sequence. The sun went behind the ridge and the temperature dropped as it always did, and the smoke from the chimney caught the last light for a moment going amber. Ridge didn't move from the steps. He sat in the cooling air and looked at what 6 months of hard work had built out of what the world had thrown away, and he thought about his father and about Gerald and about the logging road and the gate and the third match in the dark. He thought about footprints in mud and a tin cup hanging from a nail and water coming out of a rock that had been running since before either of them was born. He thought about staying. It was not a complicated feeling. It was, in fact, one of the simplest things he had ever felt. A place that was his. A brother who was healthy and whole. A spring that would run into summer and a garden that would produce and an orchard that had 3 years of work ahead of it before it would give what it was capable of giving. Work he would do. Had already begun. He picked up the envelope from beside him on the step. He'd been carrying it in his jacket for weeks, bringing it out in the evening, sometimes reading it again, and he looked at the handwriting on the front. Ridge and Wren. Careful letters. Deliberate. Written by hands that had almost stopped working, but hadn't stopped yet. He put it back in his jacket. Beside him, Wren had fallen quiet in the particular way he felt quiet when he was watching something carefully. Ridge followed his gaze. At the edge of the orchard, where the last light was still catching the new apple blossoms, the trees had come into bloom 10 days ago, white flowers covering every branch more than Ridge had expected, more than the years of neglect should have allowed a single branch move without wind. Then another, and the whole near edge of the orchard was white and moving in a breeze that came down from the ridge, and the blossoms lifted and spun, and some of them carried across the clearing toward the cottage, crossing through the last of the afternoon light, and Wren put his cup down on the step and watched them come. Ridge watched them too. The light faded, the blossoms settled. The bird at the creek called its 4 notes into the gathering dark and then was quiet. Neither of them moved for a long time. There was nowhere else to go. There never had been. There was only this, the smoke and the spring and the work ground and the old trees coming back into themselves after years of no one watching. And someone watching now.